Hey everyone, it's Jennifer from Last Stitch. In today's video I want to talk about one of the most versatile way of hemming knit fabrics using a regular sewing machine. You might already have guessed what I'm talking about. If not, I am of course talking about the twin needle or double needle, which is a great little tool to achieve that nice finish on pretty much any type of knit garments. But there are some challenges when you're using this needle, so that's what I'm going to talk about in today's video, where I share all my best tips and tricks to avoid those common pitfalls and really use the best techniques for the best result. A twin needle is a double needle that you can insert in any regular sewing machine, because it still only has one top part here, which makes it really easy to insert in the bar in your regular sewing machine. What a twin needle stitch is, it's actually two straight rows on the right side of the fabric, and when you turn the fabric to the reverse side, there's actually kind of like a zigzag pattern formed. And the great thing about this is it combines two things: a nice straight stitch on the front and the zigzag pattern on the back. Well, that means one great thing, namely excellent stretch, right? Because you all know that if you haven't tried already. If you have used a regular straight stitch on a stretchy fabric, you know what will happen once you stretch out the fabric. Why, right? It will pop, the seam will break, but thanks to the zigzag pattern on the back, the stretch is here. So that is why a twin needle is such an attractive option if you only have a regular sewing machine. Now, of course, when you look inside professional made garments, they are done with a Coverstitch machine, and if you haven't already checked all my videos about Coverstitch machine, I highly recommend them too if you want to learn more about that type of machine. But in today's video we're only going to talk about the twin needle and all the ways you can use it for your sewing. What you need though is of course two spools of thread, but don't worry, you don't have to run out and buy two spools of actual thread like this, right? Instead you can just wind two bobbins like this, and if you only have one pin, which a lot of us have, you just stack both those bobbins on one pin and you have already set up your sewing machine and are ready to go. But before we get started with the actual threading, there's one thing you need to do, and that is to make sure that the tension is released. And the way you do that is to lift the presser foot, because that will release the tension disc, so you won't have any type of threading issues. I want to say one more thing about threading, is that you should always start with the spool that will go to the right needle first, and that just to avoid tangling. So we're going through all that process with one needle first. Just thread it like you would normally do a needle. But if there are two slots on your sewing machine, because I do know that some sewing machines actually have a divider, you should definitely use that thread guide to insert it. My machine doesn't have that, which is why it's extra important to actually start from the right needle. And then, of course, you just repeat it with the second thread, pull it all the way through and insert into the second needle. And one final step before we start sewing, that is to pull the thread back behind the sewing machine, because that's a great way of avoiding again getting threads tangled, because you're working with 3 threads now, and normally speaking 3 threads mean more problems, so you definitely need to be careful with that as well. As I said, I know I keep harping about that topic right now, but it's so important to make sure that all the threads are spread out and in its place. So we're going to start off with the stitch length, and the reason for that is that there are some things you need to consider. You might, of course, wonder what is a great stitch length. Well, I would say roughly 2.5, maybe up to 3. That is a good stitch length to start with. There are a couple of things you need to understand about the stitch length, and that is if you increase the stitch length, that will also mean that those zigzag stitches will be more spaced out, so there will be less zigzags on the same stretch of fabric. And what that means is that there will be less stretch, because the zigzag is the magic shape, right, that creates that stretch. So if you go maybe up to 4 or 5 or what you can on your sewing machine, you will probably risk a lot of that really nice stretch, because that's kind of the thing, right, about using twin needle, is you want to have the stretch. And another thing that's actually really important to consider is the fact that you will likely have to adjust the needle tension, even though your sewing machine has an auto tension function. And the reason for that is that the tension will very much affect the end result of the stitch. So I'm going to show you some samples now to give you a little bit of an idea of the kind of challenging you will likely face when you are stitching with a twin needle in terms of tension. So this is a sample that I have sewn using 4 different tension settings. So let's take a look at what exactly type of results that you will achieve using different type of tensions. The one at the top here is actually the lowest tension. I think I had like 2 or something like that, really low needle tension. Now, the great thing about using a really low needle tension is the fact that the seam really lies nice and flat, because one of the most common issues when you're using a twin needle on knits, especially those like lighter weight knits, is that you will get something that is called tunneling or ridges. So there's basically like a bump formed between those straight stitches, and that is usually the thing that most people are a little bit disappointed about, right, when it comes to using a twin needle. The drawback of that is that it won't look as good on the reverse side, and you will probably pay a little bit with slightly wonky stretching. And on the right side, because the needle tension is so low, you will actually not see the straight stitch will not quite lie flat on the fabric because the tension is so loose. So that's a trade-off. You will have a flat seam, but it's not ideal. And then we have the other extreme, which I'm going to show you here now. In this case, which is the final one, is that I actually cranked up the tension to, I think, max, right? In my case, I think it's 9 or 10 or something like that, crazy. If you look close, you will see that this causes some really intense tunnelings. That is not a great idea. And I think the reason why it's tempting to go for this type of look is because you'll get too hung up on how the stitch look on the reverse side. I mean, normally when you're working with tension, you don't want the needle thread to be too exposed on the reverse side of the fabric, and you don't want the bobbin thread to be exposed on the right side of the fabric, because that's kind of like the mindset, right, when it comes to good tension. But you need to sort of let go of that concept when it comes to using a twin needle, because I would argue on many sewing machines you will struggle to get a nice flat stitch if you actually aim to reduce the needle thread on the reverse side. So you need to find like a happy medium, and I think in this case probably sample number 2 or 3 are the much better ones in this case, because you will still see some needle thread on the reverse side, but you will also get a nice flat seam. And again, there is no steadfast rule on this. I would recommend that you experiment, see what works for you, and remember that each machine and each type of fabric will behave differently. So even though you have some advice on the right settings, you always need to remember that the truth is in the samples of that particular fabric that you plan to use. Let's talk about sewing. I do recommend that you make sure that the needle will hit the fabric, so you don't go outside the fabric, because again you need to avoid those tanglements situation happening. So what you do is that you make sure that the needle will hit the fabric slightly inside, and then remember that with a twin needle, because you're using a regular sewing machine, you can backstitch to secure. So it's better to start slightly in the fabric and not just at the edge of the fabric, and you stitch, backstitch, and then you start stitching. Now remember, you are working with knits, so do not pull the fabric. Just gently guide it when you're sewing, because otherwise you will end up with a stretched out mess, which is unfortunately very common when you are hemming knits with a regular sewing machine. And once you're done, backstitch again to secure the seam, and now it is time to test the sample. I'm going to look for a few different things. First of all, probably the most important thing, does it stretch? If it does, perfect. If it doesn't, well, you might need to reduce the stitch length. And secondly, will there be a lot of tunneling when you're actually pulling the fabric apart? Because then you will probably need to do some changes for the settings. And thirdly, of course, making sure that no stitching is popping. If it doesn't, well, then you've done a good job and you can actually start making your garment. So now I'm going to talk about all the common issues and how to fix them. The first one is, of course, tunneling or ridges. And as I talked about earlier in this video, the easiest fix is just to adjust the needle tension, like reduce it. If you are having troubles using the twin needle on some fabrics and want to get rid of those ridges, try a stretch fusible. In this case, I've used that. Because what you do is that you place and fuse a piece of strip, making sure that it stretches the same way as the fabric does, on that fabric edge, and then you stitch over it, and that will make your garment look really, really flat and nice, even if you're just using a twin needle. Now, stretch fusible for knit garments is a whole topic into itself, and the great news is that I already created a video about this particular topic. So once you're done watching this video, I do recommend to check out that video to learn more about stretch fusibles and which type to use for which type of sewing technique. Now, one thing that is also very important to know when it comes to avoiding tunneling is that you should make sure that both needles sew over both layers of fabric. That is because if one needle only sews through one layer of fabric, which is a really neat look, of course, it looks so beautiful on the reverse side because the zigzag stitch will cover the fabric edge. When you look at the reverse side, you're like, oh, that looks so great, but because of the uneven layers, there's a high risk that the tunnel effect will be amplified if you're using this technique. So again, one thing that I want to bring home with this video is that you should not be obsessed about how the stitch look on the reverse side, because the most important thing is how it looks on the right side and that it performs well, it has all the stretch properties and all that stuff. Don't really obsess about how it looks on the reverse side, because that will usually actually mean that you will need to do some compromises with the overall function of the stitch. Now, another common issue when you're sewing stretchy fabric on a sewing machine and even on a cover stitch, unfortunately, is skipped stitches. And that can happen especially on more densely knitted fabrics, synthetic fabrics, because sometimes the needle isn't able to penetrate fully through the fabric, and that usually hinders the full loop to form, basically create that stitch. So in this case, I am actually using the stretch needle version of twin needles because that has a more pronounced ball point. So it's actually designed to prevent those skip stitches. Unfortunately, there is no guarantee that this will work because, you know, it has some pros and cons. But if you want to get your hands on the stretch version of twin needle, I will provide links to several brands in the description section of this video, so you can check that out and see for yourself. I do find that these are really nice. Also, they usually come in smaller sizes, so there's less risk that you get those annoying holes and stuff like that. Another simple way of reducing the risk for skip stitches is to use that fusible interfacing again, because that also creates a nice even surface for the needle to penetrate. So I do find that using a fusible interfacing really helps with skip stitches. And another issue that is unfortunately quite common when you are sewing knits on a regular sewing machine is the fact that the fabric tends to get a bit stretched out. And the reason for that is that the feed dogs, the way they move doesn't, how shall I put it, doesn't really sync with the way knit fabrics behave. So for instance, if you have a serger or cover stitch machine, you know that you will have that differential feed setting, and that is the speed of the feed dog. So by increasing the differential feed, you will increase the feed dog, and that will prevent the fabric from stretching out. But the regular sewing machine doesn't have that function, so you have a few other options. One popular option is to use this. This is a walking foot, and many people love it for sewing knits because the way the walking foot it actually feeds the upper layer in a more even motion, so you will actually end up having a pretty nice flat version of your fabric. So you can use a twin needle with most walking foot. Mine is from Bernina, so I can't unfortunately guarantee that every walking foot will work nicely with a twin needle, but I've tried it on my sewing machine, it works well. So hopefully on your sewing machine you will also be able to benefit from using a walking foot. And one of my favorite ways of controlling the feeding of the fabric is to use an awl. And this is a sewing awl or tailor awl, and you can of course use any type of like narrow and sharp object. And you won't use this to pierce hole in the fabric. Instead, what you do is that you feed the fabric in a rhythmic motion towards the presser foot while you are stitching. And what I like about using an awl is that you can control how much fabric that is actually fed. So if there's a lot of stretching out, I can just increase that motion, right? And if it's less, I can slow that down. And another great way of preventing the fabric from stretching out is to use this product. It's called Wonder Tape. And if you watched some of my other videos, you know I'm a big fan. And if not, Wonder Tape is a double-sided water-soluble tape that you place on the fabric. You sandwich it together. So for instance, if you're hemming, you place it on the fabric edge, then you fold the fabric over, and this little glue on these strips will keep the fabric in place. And when you rinse it in water, the tape will disappear. And of all the methods that I tried for this video, I would say that hands down, the Wonder Tape did the best job of preventing the fabric from getting stretched out unevenly. So in this sample that I'm holding here, it's done with the Wonder Tape. And now of course you can't test the stretch, right? Because I haven't washed away the Wonder Tape. But when you do, you will get a nice, really nice finish. So if you're sewing a lot of knit fabrics and are only using a sewing machine, perhaps Wonder Tape could be that magic helper that will actually solve a lot of those issues that you might experience when you're sewing with knits. So yeah, that was my complete guide to hemming knits using a twin needle and a regular sewing machine. I hope that you found this video useful. And if you have any more suggestions, tips and tricks, recommendations for brands and sewing machine, all that good stuff, please drop us a note in the comment section so that we can learn from each other. And don't forget to check out all my other videos. I've done a ton of them about how to sew knits using a regular sewing machine. And of course, links to those videos will be in the description section. Thank you so much for watching. Stitch safe, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye bye!